Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Linda, and I'm originally from Michigan, now living in the St. Louis metro area. I'm a college coach with School Match for You and have a daughter at University of Chicago.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Good afternoon, friends. Very excited about today's episode 378. And if you're just tuning in for the first time, you're at the Your College Bound Kid podcast, where we have an episode every Thursday, every Monday, normally around 2 hours on Thursday and around 1 hour on Monday. And our goal is to make college knowledge available to all. We have 7 co-hosts and a staff of 18. And so excited about today. But before I get into the content, I am going to share a few personal things with you today. One is exhilarating and one is excruciating. I'm also going to start a 3-part segment on test scores over the next 3 weeks that I think you're going to enjoy. Today, I want to address a very common misperception that I'm encountering a lot in the counseling room concerning test scores. Next week, I want to take a look at a couple things that are often misunderstood about test scores, and particularly related to the common data set. And it can allow students, parents, others looking at the common data set to misread the information they're reading about test scores. And then the third week, I want to share something to keep an eye on regarding test scores that might be worth paying attention to. So a little tease, but 3-parter on test scores. And then, of course, we'll have part 2 of Lisa's outstanding interview with Dr. Andrea Brenner. And this is why you continue to listen to Your College Bound Kid after your student is done with the college process, because Dr. Brenner is really taking parents through a tutorial of all the things you can do now to get your student to be college ready. But before we dive in, I do want to correct something from last week and address something else I said several months ago that I've gone back and forth about mentioning, but a listener wrote in and recommended I address it, so I'm going to address it. So last week I was talking about St. Lawrence, and I mentioned by Albany. St. Lawrence is closer to Montreal than Albany, so I just wanted to make that correction. Now, what's the thing several months ago? Well, Lisa and I did a spotlight on High Point University, and afterward, High Point came under a lot of scrutiny because it looked like they may lose their accreditation. I didn't want to mention it because I feel like that's such a stigma to a school that some people will not even consider that. And as I looked into it, it looked like it's a fairly minor infraction that looks like it's going to blow over, and I don't think there are going to be any issues with accreditation. So I don't want to stigmatize them. But I did go back and forth because we do want to be completely transparent. And in the spirit of full disclosure, part of me felt like, well, I kind of owe it to the audience to let you know that. But then I think, well, am I stigmatizing the school for what looks like it's going to be cleared up pretty quickly? But a listener really helped me process that and said, a lot of us are listening to you out here, and you really need to tell the listeners. So I was on the fence anyway, and so they persuaded me about that. All right, let's start out with the personal things. One that's exhilarating and one I'm struggling with. All right. Well, normally, I'm like, get the bad news out first about the excruciating before you get to the exhilarating, but I'm going to start with the exhilarating. So a little personal thing about me. So, we grew up my brother and my sister, both our parents, who are both educators, by the way, on several acres of property, literally right on Lake Erie. Like you look out our backyard and all you can see is Lake Erie for as far as your eyes can see. And it really kind of impacted my love for nature. And I've sort of been trying to recreate my childhood. I think a lot of us do that ever since. So we bought our first home in Westchester, Pennsylvania in 1997 and absolutely loved it. It was fantastic. But, I was ready after a dozen years there to kind of get more land and to get a little bit more nature. That first house was a townhouse, but it was an amazing starter home. Clean, safe neighborhood, was awesome. So when we moved here to just south of the airport here in Atlanta, we moved into a subdivision called The Lakes. And it has 5 lakes and trees galore, and the landscaping is just spectacular. And we've been here 14 years and we love it, but it's only like a third of an acre. So it kind of felt claustrophobic based on how I grew up. And for a while, I was looking at houses around to try to see, could we get something with kind of that acreage? I wanted that feel, that I grew up with. But boy, to get the kind of house that we were looking for was going to really cost a lot of money. So we decided to fix up what we have because we're fortunate in that we just have all these woods behind us. So over the last 3 years, we've had all these trees taken down. It's about 3/4 of an acre back there. And now we're getting it all developed in like a major landscaping project. And so now our home is like just how I like it and absolutely love it. It's like my respite, my zen. It's just so serene. And so I'm just out there a lot and enjoying life. So that's my exhilarating. Now, this is my excruciating. I said it's going to get a little personal today before we get into admissions. All right, friends, I'm going to be really honest. I've been struggling because I haven't wanted to share this with you. But I always talk about how important it is with our students to be authentic, to be transparent. So I feel like I need to model the message here and not be a hypocrite. But before I do, I'm going to share a brief anecdote with a client. I was working with this client in 2017, local client. And she came and met me at our home office. This was pre-COVID. I've got a couple offices here, turned our basement into an office, and then I have a first floor office. So I've got a great place for meeting people, but nobody ever comes, either because of COVID or honestly, most of the people I work with don't live in Georgia. So anyway, this mom was from Georgia, and she came and she met, and she had been recently laid off. And she said, do you know how hard it is to find work when you're 54? She said, I've experienced more age discrimination than racial discrimination. This is a Black female. So how does this relate to me? Well, let me just get it out there. This is painful. All right, here it is. I turn 60 next Tuesday. November 21st is my birthday, and I'm really, really struggling with it. On one sense, I feel great. I mean, I was out there for an hour this morning with a pickaxe slamming into that Georgia clay. I'm replacing this hibiscus we have with another crepe myrtle. I've got in a bit of a crepe myrtle addiction, I think. It'll be number 22. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, look up CRAPE, second word MYRTLE in Google Images. It's something the South is known for. They have them in California and Texas too. And they're absolutely gorgeous. And the one thing I love about being here, and so it's like our 22nd crepe myrtle. So I got a bit of a crepe myrtle addiction, but my neighbor loves this hibiscus. So I'm planting the hibiscus for her. Both my neighbors are awesome. One to the left is from Cali. This is the one that's getting the crepe myrtle. I mean, the hibiscus. One to the right is from Ohio. And anyway, I'm getting off tangent here. But I remember when Norma and I were kids. And I remember one conversation we were having. And I remember saying, Norm, that dude's 35. That dude is old. So I just remember thinking 35 was old. So I thought 50 was going to be like this, cataclysmic experience for me, stressful beyond belief, midlife crisis. But I was shocked it wasn't an issue. But 60? Are you serious? And I've been really, really honest with you. I've been not wanting to share that with you guys. In fact, Dave's older than me, so Dave turned 60 in March. I would have shouted out his birthday on here, but I was like, I don't want to do that because people know Dave and I are the same age. Or even last week, Lee Coffin was like, hey, I turned 60. And, and I said, hey, we're both born in 1963. And then I said, but you're older than me. And then I was going to edit that out. So it's just my sense that you get discriminated against. Right now, Michigan State is looking for a football coach, and they've got this amazing guy on the horizon, impeccable resume. And they're like, the dude's 59. We need somebody younger. So I haven't wanted to share that. I'm having some major issues with it. I'm trying to work through it, and just being completely honest with you. So I hope I don't get discriminated against. But it is what it is. So that's the hard part. But more exhilaration. We are having a major celebration, and this has me fired up. So we're spending 4 days in Mars Hill, North Carolina, which is 20 miles north of Asheville. We've got this big cabin house rented. It's going to be amazing. Person just designed it for like something like this. It's got the hot tubs and the pool tables and the shuffleboards and beautiful vistas. And so my mom's coming in for Canada. My daughters, live a couple hours away, will be there. Of course, Anitra and I will be there. And I'm excited. My brother Norm can't come, but he was here last week. We had a great time. And then after 4 days in Mars Hill, we're going to Durham, where both Karis and Joy just became roommates. On October 21st, they moved into the new 2-bedroom, 2-bath. And they started a tradition last year in Charlotte where they made Thanksgiving dinner for us. And so they want that to be an every year tradition. So we'll spend 4 days there. So exhilarated about the place, excruciating, trying to deal with the psychology that the big 6-0 is 9 days away from me, but also exhilarated about the 8 days celebration. I'm actually taking 7 days off work, which I never do. 18th to the 25th, I'll be chilling. All right, let's get to college admissions. Sorry I digressed for so long. Hopefully you didn't find that boring. All right, so today I want to talk, like I said, the first part of 3 about test scores. And what I want to talk about today is the misperception about test scores, one that I'm encountering a lot in the counseling room. So for the most part, and you guys who are regular, especially those in our listening family, that's those who never miss an episode. You're my favorite people. Sorry, I'm biased. You've heard me say that the only time I'm going to take a question is a speak by question, because I just like the community feel, and I've heard good feedback from everybody. And if you guys want to do it, then those are the questions we're going to put up. But there's one exception. That's when I'm bombarded by the same question over and over and over in the counseling room. And then I'll address it on a Monday episode. And that's what's happening here. It's this misperception about test scores. So in order to make the point, I'm going to share 3 stories to show this misperception. The first was about 6 weeks ago, and then there were 2 this week. So about 6 weeks ago, I'm working with a business owner. It's in one of the Rocky Mountain states regions of the country. Very successful business owner. Has several hundred people that works for him. And I'm working with, worked with his son. Now I'm working with his second student. So, and the dad was talking to me, and he was telling me that he thought Williams would be a great fit for his student. And he thought that her 1400 SAT score would really be something that would be impressive. And I had to say to him that I'm going to be totally honest with you. 1400 is no longer a competitive score for Williams, especially coming from a highly resourced family. You're not underrepresented. Now, you aren't an underrepresented part of the country, but still, Williams is really, really selective. And I actually think that test score is not going to serve you well. And this dad is as calm and cool and collective as they get. I really, really like him a lot. He's really fun. He's smart. He's engaging. I enjoy talking to him. I'd never seen him lose his temper, but he blew a gasket. And he's like, I hire people all over. You can't tell me that somebody with a 1400 on the SAT can't do the program at Williams. I don't buy it. And I realized, okay, we're on different wavelengths, because he thinks the only reason why the test score matters as an indicator of whether you can be academically successful at the school once you get there. So that's story number 1. Okay, story number 2, podcast listener. Okay, great podcast listener, communicates with us a lot. And this podcast listener was emailing me back and forth this week. And they were like, Mark, do you see the brouhaha and the ruckus on Facebook about Case Western and Northeastern? I'm like, no, clue me in. What happened? What's going on? So the listener sent me the link, and I clicked the link, and it didn't work. And then the listener tried to get the link to work, and they couldn't get it to work. And then finally, I just got an email, and it said this. The gist of it was that Case Western sent everyone who applied early with test scores an email offering to let them switch to test optional. Now, once again, I can't verify it. I didn't see it with my own eyes, but I have no reason to disbelieve this. And so in the context, the listener thought this is messed up. And I responded and said, I have a different opinion of this than you do. So I said, send me a little bit more information, because I might want to address this on a podcast episode. So once again, if the perception is the only reason test scores matter is to see if you're academically able to do the program, then that would be pretty crazy, right? Why would you be interested in somebody without their test scores? Like, what's going on? It appears to be just pure manipulation in order to improve the test scores of their perception of your school. That's how that looks on the surface. All right, fast forward to story number 3. In the counseling room again this week. The first person I told you in the Rocky Mountain State, I don't think they've ever heard our podcast, but this person has heard our podcast. And in fact, we were talking, and after the third person had something similar, I said, you just gave me content for this week's podcast. So what happened here? So we're having a conversation about their student, and their student has really, really good grades, but isn't a strong tester. And so I was explaining to them how, in all likelihood, your student is going to be a test optional applicant. And I explained to them how in the last 3 years, 56% of the population, 54% and 52% have been non-submitters for 3 years in a row. 3 years in a row, more people did not submit scores than submitted scores. And the parent asked a great question. And it's a similar theme to the parent from the Rocky Mountain State and even to the email that came in this week, which was, why would a school use new test score averages? Don't they have enough research from the past to know what kind of test score can be academically successful? Why would they adjust their expectations, especially considering the fact that half the population's not submitting? Like, why don't they use the old numbers? They should have enough history to know a 1,400 or a 1,100 or a 900 or whatever the school is can be successful at our school. And I said, okay, this is 3 times this has come up now in a short period of time. Let me address it. So what is it that I'm addressing? How test scores are used. So a significant portion, well, my sense is that most of the public thinks that test scores are primarily used for one thing, as a significant part of the academic evaluation to determine whether a student can do the academic program. And I would admit that is one way that test scores are used. In fact, test scores, along with class rigor, meaning the difficulty of your courses, grades, grade trends, and in some cases, the school you're coming from in a more holistic sense. So the more holistic schools will really take into consideration the school and what data they have or knowledge they have of the school and reading the profile and all of that. They can form the academic quantitative initial review. And you say, what about recs? Aren't they academic? Yeah, they are, but that comes in a little later. Just an initial bird's eye. Does this student look competitive? And by the way, there's no doubt in my mind that as applications rise, this quick quantitative review is being done at more places, and students are summarily being dismissed if they're non-competitive. Dismissed meaning they're not thoroughly getting read. It's a quicker cursory read. I'm not saying that's happening everywhere, but I absolutely believe it's happening at more places than the public probably realizes. So you go into a non-competitive pool and then you're pretty much dead. Okay. Now you have to listen to Thursday's podcast because Lee Coffin's going to break some news about how they're handling the rise of applications. And he's going to share a much more transparent, much more scientific, and a much more thorough process than I believe a lot of places are doing. But nevertheless, I know this is going on. But using test scores as part of the academic review is only one of the three main ways schools use test scores. Let me repeat that. Using test scores to determine whether or not you're able to be academically successful is only one of the three main ways schools use test scores. So what are the other two ways? Well, I'm just full of stories today. I don't know if that's good or bad. But I'm going to share with you a story. This goes about 5 years ago. A family I was working with, their student was attending a school called Nightingale Bamford. It's in New York City. And I was having a conversation with the dad about test scores. Their student happened to be really, really strong tester. In fact, she had a perfect 36 on the ACT. But the dad said this to me. He said, the first thing I look at when I'm looking at a school is what are the test scores? Now, not everybody does that, but he's not the only one who does it. I'm convinced test scores is one of the big four ways that people compare colleges. Initially, I've developed this theory, and if you heard my interview with Miljan Trulove, the VP of Enrollment at Reed, I shared this with him, and he completely agreed with me. So what are the four main ways the public looks at and evaluates as a school any good initially? By the way, I'm not advocating for this. This is just what's done. Well, one is test scores. Another is acceptance rates. A third is rankings. And a fourth is just when you bounce the name of a school off of people who are significant to you, how do they react? People actually calibrate in their mind great school all the way to not a great school based on the reaction from their significant others. It's the old George Herbert Cooley's looking glass self concept of how people form self-images. Go back and look at sociology. But it applies to college admissions as well. So I'll oftentimes share this when I'm in a Zoom call with the family about how this is one of the ways people categorize schools, and that the public tends to think better school, better test scores. And consistently when I share that, families are nodding their heads. I understand that. I agree with you. I get that all the time. So think about it. If the families out there are using test scores as one of the ways of calibrating if they think a school is good, then if a student's test scores are lower than the profile of who a school brings in, you just made it harder for me to recruit. And it's already extremely hard to recruit. It's already extremely competitive out there. Why would I want to make it harder for myself to do my job? Susan and I, when we were together at Western, we used to always talk about this, protecting the profile. Schools protect the profile, their 25th to 75th percent profile. They don't like to have that go down every year. And one of the reasons why is it makes it harder to recruit. So the public oftentimes thinks, like the family I was referring to in the Rocky Mountain State, when he was saying, don't tell me a 1,400 can't do the program because I hired hundreds of people and know that it can. And you can be extremely successful in life with that test score. He was right, but he was talking apples and oranges. Schools are often saying, are you going to make it harder for me to recruit? Are you going to make it harder for me to do my job? Our family's going to think our school's not as good because our scores went down from last year. Anything that makes it harder for me to do my job is not going to be very appealing for me. It doesn't mean that sometimes you're not going to go way out of profile. That's because somebody else is bringing some institutional priorities that you value. But in general, if somebody's not bringing institutional priorities that you value, why would you make it harder to do your job? And I think if you can understand test scores from that perspective, it will help you to understand certain things. I remember a few years ago when Andy Strickler was involved in a big brouhaha at Connecticut College. By the way, Andy's coming on the podcast. I can't wait to interview him. But I saw him at NACAC, not this year's NACAC 2023, but 2022. I saw him at NACAC in Houston. And we were talking about it. I was like, yeah, man, I took a lot of heat for that. I was just trying to help people. Yeah, he was trying to bring a student in that he wanted to have at the school. Oh, I should probably give you a little background. So Andy was involved in letting a student know that, hey, we can admit you if you'll switch to test optional, because they're really, trying to have students be 1390 or above. And so it looked like, we caught you. All you're trying to do is be exploitive. All you're trying to do is manufacture up your test scores. But I didn't look at it that way. And Brendan and I were in California for a week, Brendan Barnard, and we both thought, I think Andy was just trying to help the student. I had the same conversation with Julia, the same thing. He's trying to help the student. I mean, don't get me wrong. He's not naive about the fact that I also am not trying to make it harder for myself to recruit. Why would I want to do that? But maybe there's a way that I can not make it harder for myself to recruit and still give a student an opportunity to school that they're interested in. But if you don't understand that, and if you don't understand how hard it is to recruit and how the family's going to think your school's lower, not as good if your test scores go down, then maybe you may not understand why I might do that, or why Case would even say what they said this week on Facebook, apparently. All right. So, but believe it or not, that's not the only reason. So we've talked about test scores as part of the academic evaluation, along with rigor, along with grades, along with grade trends, along with the school you're coming from, as part of that initial quick academic quantitative review. And we've talked about it making it harder to recruit students, because if the public thinks test scores is one way they judge schools, and they think, why did your test scores go from 1130 down to 1110? You must be going in the wrong direction. And now it's going to be harder for me to yield you. Why would I want to do that? Okay, unless you're bringing something incredible to the table. But there's a third reason. Let's talk about how an admission office is evaluated. Unless your school is floundering and on the brink of having to close, yeah, you might be judged by whether or not you met your class, whether or not the school was full, whether you got enough heads in beds. But for any halfway selective school, nobody's going to be high-fiving you and giving you a pay raise and giving you job security because you're full. The mindset they're going to have is anybody could be full if you just fill your school up with anybody. So people are going to turn to qualitative metrics to evaluate you for your performance. And I'm not talking about the public here. When I was talking about that Nightingale Bamford story, I was talking about prospective families. Now I'm talking about the people you report to. If you heard my interview with Eric Furta, former Dean of Admission at Penn, I asked him, who does the admission office, director of admission, VP of enrollment report to? And it's a complex answer because different schools have different structures. He went into how it was different at Columbia than it is at Penn, and anyway. So the point is, there are lots of different people that you report to, depending on the school. In some cases, it's the provost, who's the chief academic officer. In some cases, it's the president. In some cases, it's the board of trustees. Of course, the board is always there at some level. In some cases, it's the faculty. In some cases, it's a combination where they may pull together a group of people, maybe the provost and the president and maybe some senior faculty, are part of it. And that's who you're answering to. It's group different people. But most of us don't like to do things that are going to lead to a poor job evaluation. Like, who's going to do that? One of my favorite axioms is what gets inspected gets expected. So who would want to do something to lead to a less stellar job performance? So if no one is impressed with you being full, what are some of the things that those who you report to look at? Well, acceptance rate is one. That's why I'm never surprised. Every year around this time, you have schools that send out messages saying, we're extending our ED deadlines. And either way, it's not the only reason. Sometimes it was a tornado or hurricane or natural disaster in the area or something. But a lot of times, it's like, hey, we didn't get enough applications compared to the previous year. And the people that I have to answer to are going to say, why did our ED apps drop by 3%? So in some cases, it's acceptance rate. In some cases, and I shouldn't say in some cases, because in most cases, it's a combination of all these things, right? Could be your compositional diversity goals. That's almost always it, because that's such a broad term. What am I talking about here? It could be how many Pell Grant students you have. Depends if that's an institutional priority. How many first-gen students you have. Could be your gender ratio, male-female. It could be the number of countries you have, or the number of states, or the percentage out of state, or the in-state, out-of-state ratio, or this is not really talked about in polite company because it's really offensive, but behind closed doors, how many full-pay families, or a very common thing that's talked about behind closed doors is what's called net tuition revenue, which is basically how much is the average person paying. It could be goals and targets that you have by major or by school. In the past, race had been one of those, and nobody kind of wants to go near that with a 10-foot pole right now. But compositional diversity, that's definitely going to be something that the admission office is going to be reporting back to. Once again, most people for a halfway selective school are not just going to be impressed with the fact that you're full. They're going to say, full with who? But there's another one in that list which I left for last, and it is test scores. Absolutely test scores. Faculty are notorious for valuing test scores, especially engineering faculty. They're notorious for that. So when it comes to looking at how test scores are taken into consideration, it's not just part of the academic assessment to see if you can do the program. It's not just that. It's also, how's this going to impact how prospective students and parents see our school if our trend line is toward lower scores versus higher scores. And it's also, how are the people that I'm reporting to going to see my job performance? And most of us, if we're honest, don't like to do things that are going to have a deleterious impact on how we're perceived by our bosses or our upline or whoever we report to. And so that explains why, as soon as we got into this test optional phase we're in, I knew right away that schools were going to use the new numbers and not the old numbers as in terms of what they're going to expect. Sure, they have plenty of evidence that a student can do their program with way lower scores than their medians and means. Absolutely. Never get an argument with me out of that. But that's not the only question. It's also, is it going to make it harder for me to recruit? And are the people that I report to going to be happy with the students that I'm bringing in? And usually some component of test scores is part of that evaluation. All right, friends, hopefully you enjoyed this. And I have 2 more parts I'm doing on test scores. Next week, I'll be talking about 2 things about the common data set that don't make it as accurate as you might like it to be when it comes to looking at test scores. And then next, the final week, we'll talk about something to keep your eye on that just might be, I think trend is too strong of a word, but something worth watching when it comes to test scores. So those are the next 2 weeks. But I don't want to take any more time because Lisa's got a fantastic interview with Dr. Andrea Brenner, part 2.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part 2 of 4 of Lisa's interview with Dr. Andrea Brenner, Dr. Brenner tells us what little failures are and why they are so important. Dr. Brenner shares what AP courses are good for, but she also shares what AP tests are not. Dr. Brenner talks about something that is very important for students to learn by the 10th grade. Now, that's a tease. Dr. Brenner teaches us what the stress-distress model is, and how this can help a student with their own mental health. Dr. Brenner talks about how COVID impacted this generation's college readiness.
It's not just kids preparing. It's also what parents can do. And I do say to high school parents all the time, if you are the parent who notices the history paper in the printer and rushes it over to school because your kid forgot it, you need to stop doing that, right? Your student needs to understand what it feels like to forget, if the coach is going to be angry if you don't have your uniform, and we need to stop bailing our kids out. Now, I'm a believer that that's not, when it comes to health and safety, that's our role as
No, of
parents.
course not.
I would never, ever, suggest that. But
Mm-hmm.
it's such a disservice when we do too much as parents. We do too much for our kids. We're fixers. We do it really well. We do it way better than our kids. And then a lot of students head off to college, and mom or dad is not there to do the daily stuff for them, and they can really suffer, and their grades can really suffer.
Yeah, here's a question. I mean, 100% agree with you about letting kids have natural consequences. But I think sometimes parents don't, because there exists this high pressure cooker situation where, let's say the kid gets a B in history because they didn't turn their paper in, and then, oh my gosh, they're not going to Harvard, or whatever the stepwise plan is supposed to be. And I think that's what trips parents up from just saying, all right, you know what, you do you, I'm going to go focus on my own life. If the teacher's mad at you, the teacher's mad at you. What are your thoughts about that, and how can we as parents work against that pressure?
Right. Well, I would say starting early is the best bet. So starting maybe even in ninth grade, letting our children have little fails that are not going to derail their high school or college career, right? So as I mentioned, leaving the soccer uniform, you're not going to get kicked off the team if you don't go once. Leaving the history paper, and then once that history paper is left and maybe the grade is lowered, maybe you help your child come up with a system so they don't forget. So maybe it's posted on the door, or maybe it's an alarm on their phone. So it's not, I don't think it's black or white. I think there's a gray area, and I think it's time for teaching. So the earlier, the better. I believe very strongly in little failures that are absolutely not going to derail somebody. And ideally, if we do that early, by the time they're in 11th or 12th grade,
right, then they've got it down.
They do have it down.
Yeah, I always keep telling my kids, failure is the new success, and then they get really mad at me. But
I like that.
Oh well, yeah, because that is, and we know so much about learning, and that failing is the way that learning sticks the most in your brain. So if you make a mistake, like writing a sentence in Spanish, and then you get upset, then you're never gonna forget that again. And so that's kind of how the human mind works. So I think it's kind of a shame that we even have this conversation about well, how can you have them go through the natural process of growth and maturation and education and then put it to college admissions
right,
at the same time.
Right. But I've met families that, parents in 11th grade are still waking their kid up for school. And, that's, to me, not a great sign for that kid going to be, being able to do that and not rely on a roommate to do that in college. So, one day they sleep in and they're late, they probably won't do that again. But it is our job to come up with ways that they can send themselves reminders.
Yeah. So it's kind of being the scaffold around the prevention of future errors, I guess.
I agree with that.
Say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think that's something we can all work on. I know I certainly can. So, what about kids who take AP classes? I think my daughter kind of thought well, I took AP such and such, so I know everything about, the subject. And then, so the dean of my son's middle school was telling me that his son took AP chemistry, and then he goes to NC State and he's in this class and he has no idea what they're talking about. And it's all about the periodic table. And that's when his father calls the former chemistry teacher and realizes they didn't teach that to him in that particular class. So, it was just such a shock. He thought he was completely prepared. How do you coach kids around realistic expectations about their AP classes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say APs are great for two functions. Or three functions, let me say. One is just kind of prep you with content area for college. And some schools will grant you, into a second level class if you have gotten, whatever grade or et cetera, grade you score. Or if you've successfully taken an AP class, you might be able to, bump out of Psych 101 and move into a 200 level psych class. The other thing is that it's really important to remember that APs are not college classes. They're college content taught to high school students. And they're actually, the AP textbooks are not college textbooks. They're AP textbooks. They're written for the high school brain. And the way that a high school student might chunk things differently or learn differently. So there's a big difference between a 16-year-old brain and a 20-year-old brain.
Yes.
So, and not every school offers them, and a lot of private schools are moving away from them for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Colleges want you to take the highest level courses that you can take at your school. If you can handle, at least getting a B in an AP class, I always encourage students, if they still have, are able to function and balance the rest of life, it's a great idea. But I think it's really important to remember that this is preparation for your intro level high school class,
right.
College classes.
Yeah, it's like preparation. It's not an equivalent.
Correct. I would agree with that. And every class is different, if it's not standardized. And AP classes often are more standardized than others,
right.
but high school classes in general are not standardized across the country. And so that can be really frustrating to a student who thinks they know a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah.
They come in and they find out not so much. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have recommendations about different time management strategies that students can use?
I think there's not one path. And I think everybody's brain is different. So a student with processing issues is going to, have a different way of thinking about things. I think it's really important to figure out the best way that you can learn. And I think that by 10th grade, students should figure out how they learn best, because how they learn best will help them study best, right? So are you an auditory learner? Do you need to see visuals? Are you somebody who needs both? Do you need to listen while you're making charts and graphs or pictograms, whatever it might be? And I do think that you have to think about the way you learn before you understand the way that you can study. And I think that's frustrating, because sometimes students in high school are expected to study a certain way, and that might not be the best way for their brain to process things. So I think it's almost taking a step back, figuring out how your brain functions and how best you take in information, especially new information, before you figure out the way to study.
Yeah, I mean, I found that for myself, I'm such an auditory processor. I mean, and so even in my career, I've been expected to take all these notes, and I struggle with it so much because it distracts me from listening to what I'm supposed to be listening to. So for me, missing class was never an option because I needed to go hear it from the professor. But, other kids learn different ways. They have to see it visually. My daughter with ADD seems to learn best while she's singing and dancing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Sure, right.
Library studying is probably not for her.
Right.
The other patrons will be angry. So it's like trying to figure all that out. It can be a real process.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. What about social emotional skills? Because part of adjusting to college is classes, but then there's the whole other part of how do you live your life there.
Right.
What kind of skills do they need?
So there are many, and one of the things I do love to kind of talk about, and this is something I certainly did not create on my own, but I've learned it from my colleagues who are mental health counselors on college campuses, is what they call the stress-distress model, right? So if we think about stress on one end of a continuum and distress on the other end of the continuum, and we need to kind of throw away the assumption that everybody's baseline in college is a zero, no stress, right? That actually most kids have the baseline of pretty, on a daily basis, kind of stressed. It means you're probably doing college right. College is a little stressful. But I think it's important to, just as we would with a pain scale, right? Somebody might say, you broke your leg. Are you what's your pain scale? 7 or 8? Where are you? And a student is able to figure out where they are in a 1 through 10 or 0 through 10. I think it's really important for our students to be able to kind of nail a number with their mental health and their stress level also. And, some students really reach distress much sooner than other students, right? And some of it has to do with their ability to, to be resilient and handle things. Some people, some kids know that maybe they can't handle it on their own, but they know exactly what resources they need to find help. And so what I love to tell families is if you can have a conversation sort of with your kid before they head off to college about their number. When does your stress, kid, go from a typical stress to somewhere where you actually need some outside help? And maybe that's a 3 and maybe that's an 8. It's so hard for parents when we get calls from college from our kids who say, I hate it here. I want to leave. I'm miserable. I have no friends. College is terrible. We hear these very grand statements and they can be really overwhelming as parents.
Mm-hmm.
But if I can say to the kid, hey, are you at a 3? Are you at an 8? Where are you right now mental health wise? Where is your stress level? I think it's really easier than the narrative to kind of nail down a number.
Yeah. Quantifying things can be helpful.
For sure.
Because my daughter, she'll say, today is the worst day of my life. And I'm like, gosh, I thought that was last Tuesday. I thought that was the worst day of your life.
Right.
Right. Because, I think without a number, like she's just very dramatic,
Absolutely. And they're very much living within the moment as they should be in that adolescent brain. One of the things I love to tell to students, and we say it in our book, is if you did have that call and you just told mom, this is the worst day of my life, and the next day is fine, call back or text and say, hey, it's a better day, right? Because as parents, we hold on
you're
to
stuck
that.
with the worst day of my life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're holding on to that.
Someday it is going to be the worst day of her life and be like, I'm sure you're fine. And it won't be because I'm just like so desensitized to that. She should come up with new phrases. But I'm going to talk to her about the number thing because I think that would be that's a really great idea. Yeah. I think so much, like, do you find, and I know this is all still coming through the pike with kids, but this COVID generation, do you think they have more stress or less resilience than kids of the past? And and I suppose some of them are just starting to enter college now, so we don't really know. But how do you think they're doing?
I think they're all over the place. I think some kids are thriving because they had an experience with COVID where they did a lot on their own. They were self-starters. They figured out what their passion area was. They, sat in their room for days and days and became an excellent drummer, or they researched something in science. There were those self-starters who really benefited. I also think there are kids with who really benefited from virtual learning, especially students with sort of social emotional challenges. I think they really did benefit. But in general, I would say it was an additional stressor at an already stressful time for a college student. And I know a lot of kids who were, 2020 high school grads who are still kind of trying to get through college and really finding that they'd lost a year or even more. And they just don't have the professional skills that they might have had if they had, 2 summers of work that they really weren't allowed to have unless, they were working from home, which is just so different. Just the politics and professionalism in an office environment, if you're an intern, is priceless. And so many of our kids just didn't get that. So, I don't know that I can say it's a single path. I think kids are all over the place. And I think colleges, thank goodness, are becoming much more aware of mental health challenges. And I think students are overall better at narrating, and we have language now for mental health challenges and things like self-care. I don't know that we had such perfect language before COVID.
Friends, this concludes part 2 of 4 in Lisa's interview with Dr. Andrea Brenner. We hope you'll join us next week for part 3. On Thursday's episode, Susan and I discuss an article in the Chronicle for Higher Ed by Eric Hoover, and it looks at a new attempt to incorporate a student's character in the admission evaluation process. Susan will be back for another segment as the two of us will answer a question from a dad who wants to know, how should a student present a selective program like Tech Girls in their application so colleges understand all that is involved in both getting in and how enriching the experience is. Isn't it risky to just assume every admission officer is familiar with a program like Tech Girls? So Susan and I will tackle that. And then Julia and I continue our interview with Lee Coffin, the VP of Enrollment and the Dean of Admission at Dartmouth, as he does a spotlight for us on Dartmouth College, part 2 of 3. And our Dartmouth interview is our spotlight for the week. Friends, I close out with this quote. As you know, I'm going through 15 quotes about the personal statement. Many of you are writing their essays right now, especially for regular admissions, which is not due until January. And there's some early deadlines of November 15th and December 1 that students are working on. So this is a quote from somebody I really like a lot. I've never met her, but I've just been following her from distance, and I like her a lot. Her name's Janine Lalonde. She's the Associate Dean of Admissions at UVA. And this is what she says about the personal statement. Try to convey your voice and style in your words. This is the one spot on your application where your personality gets to shine. So don't treat this like a formal school assignment. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.